I'm Colin Sanders, and you're listening to the History Books Review. I read history books and I review them. Tonight I'm continuing my extended review of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Tonight's topic, the Emperor Elagabalus. With Caracalla dead, there was only one authority that could make an emperor, the army. Chance had it that most of the troops were gathered in Syria, so it was there and nowhere else that matters would be decided. Whatever its other faults, Caracalla was no fool, and had not allowed anyone with any chance of high office anywhere near the army. So this only left the two Praetorian prefects. Adventus didn't want the job, so with no other obvious candidate, Macrinus was declared emperor. It took 3 days before the announcement was made, so he was hardly a shoo-in. In fact, he had a number of serious problems in taking up such an exalted role. He was not a senator. Up until this time, the fiction had always been maintained that the emperor was simply one of the Senate, given extraordinary powers that were wielded on behalf of that body. This was, of course, pure fantasy, but if you wanted the Senate on your side, it was as well to pander to their egos. And given the choice, it was generally better to have the Senate with you rather than against you. But Rome was a sophisticated state with an effective civil service. An emperor could rule without the supporting network provided by the Senate, as the likes of Domitian had shown. It was a hard way to do it, though. More seriously, he was not a soldier. He simply hadn't come to prominence by that route, and not surprisingly, the soldiers didn't really see him as one of themselves, in the way they had Severus and his family. Macrinus had got to where he was by his administrative talents. Good administrators don't tend to leave interesting history behind them. The world really only works because of the men who roll their sleeves up and get on with the job. They are the kinds of people you would probably want to vote for, but who leave the pages of the history books looking rather dull. Unfortunately for the empire, but fortunately for the rest of the podcast, Macrinus was not going to last long as an emperor. He was well placed to be fully aware of the state of the empire. He knew the finances were a huge problem and that something needed to be done about them. The army was costing far too much to run, so he came up with a promising scheme to sort things out. The basic problem was that the troops were paid too much, but that any attempt to reduce their pay would result in a revolt. The scheme Macrinus came up with was a simple one, but none the worse for that. He would keep pay and conditions the same for the soldiers currently on the payroll, but new recruits would be hired on the basis of going back to the still generous package that had worked well enough in the reign of Severus. Neat, really. Left to work for a number of years, the problem would have become manageable. Sensible reforms are rarely met with a great reception. You might have supposed that the troops who were keeping their high pay rates might at least be happy with the arrangement. Not a bit of it. Macrinus was unwise enough to keep the army concentrated in Syria. This wasn't the only time he showed poor judgment in matters military, but it may have been this decision, more than any other, that cost him his job. What do the tough men of a Roman field army do when they are gathered in a large group with nothing much to do? Gossip, of course. The mood had never been particularly pro-Macrinus. He wasn't really trusted. So the reform of the pay structure was seen as the thin end of the wedge. What was he planning next? With the perception that their pay packets were at risk, and with the story about the role of Macrinus in the death of Caracalla beginning to circulate, the mood was turning ugly. It would only need a trigger to set off a revolt. Macrinus showed a surer touch when it came to court politics. This was, after all, his background. He treated the widow of Severus with great respect, a good opportunity to appear magnanimous, but Julia Domna was not, for obvious reasons, a happy woman. One of her sons had killed the other. He himself had then died a violent death after a far from glorious reign. Shortly after the death of Caracalla, she killed herself. It's not hard to see why. She probably thought that she had seen the worst that her family could come up with. In fact, she didn't see the half of it. Her elder sister was called Julia Mesa, and Macrinus was prudent enough to exile her to her hometown of Emesa in Syria. This is the modern city of Homs, and it's about 50 miles inland at about the same latitude as Cyprus. She was the leading light of one of the most influential and richest Syrian families. She had 2 daughters, both of whom were widowed, and both of whom had a son. On top of her family's wealth, she had managed to acquire a large fortune by ruthlessly exploiting her closeness to the Empress. She was obviously a skilled player. Macrinus had spotted the threat she posed and wisely got her out of the court. It seemed like her public life was over, but she wasn't someone that was that easy to get rid of. Clearly a resourceful woman, she quickly perceived that Macrinus was not that secure on the throne. She hit on the idea of putting forward her eldest grandson, the 14-year-old Bassianus, whose mother's name was Somiamus, as a possible replacement. His claim to the throne wasn't immediately obvious, but this was overcome by the simple expedient of claiming that he was the illegitimate son of Caracalla. To add a bit of depth to the claim, he was renamed Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a crafty bit of positioning. Antoninus was at the time consecrated as a priest in the Temple of the Sun in Emesa. The temple was popular with the troops stationed there, who were used to seeing the youth in attendance in his priestly outfit. It wasn't too difficult to plant the idea that he was related to Caracalla in their minds. They soon believed that they saw the features of Caracalla in his young face. Lavish gifts from Julia probably helped as well. Before long they had become firm followers and came out in open revolt against Macrinus. So Julia now had a small army at her disposal. Macrinus, on the other hand, had many legions, and could easily have snuffed out this challenge before it became serious. But the small detachment sent to dispose of the apparently insignificant uprising went over to the side of Antoninus, swelling his ranks. Meanwhile, the main army at Antioch was troubled by frequent mutinies and problems with pay and supplies. Macrinus didn't really have the touch when it came to handling the army. He dithered and let the rebellion get up a head of steam until it began to pose a very real threat. In the end, he was obliged to march out of Antioch in strength to deal with Antoninus. He still had the larger force, and the rebels were soon hard put to. War in the ancient world was a science in the hands of skilled practitioners. The outcome of a battle would generally depend on the relative resources and positions of the opposing forces. But the Battle of Antioch pitted two inexperienced and unwarlike leaders against each other. In these circumstances, the character of the protagonists proved to be the decisive factor. When things were looking bad for the rebels, Antoninus himself, young as he was, threw himself into the fray with courage. Likewise, his mother and grandmother appeared on the field to encourage their side. On the other hand, the over-cautious Macrinus lost his nerve at the crucial moment and fled. With Macrinus deserting them, his soldiers threw down their arms and embraced the men they had just been fighting as brothers. Rome had a new emperor. Macrinus was captured and killed a few days later. That Antoninus should have showed so much courage in battle was not something that you would have expected. He did not want to be either a soldier or a politician. He had been quite sincere in his desire to be a priest, and religion was going to play a large part in the story of his reign. He was a follower